So we're continuing our sermon series on When Life Hurts, and this time the title is, God, why are you punishing me? Because when you hear Job's story, you got to believe something's going on here, right? And the part we didn't read was at the beginning, talks about how it sets the context for who Job was. Job was a righteous man who loved and worshiped God. It says so right in the text. In fact, he was so worried that his children might sin once in a while that when they had their parties, he would offer burnt offerings and sacrifice in order to keep them from getting in trouble with God, just in case they did something they shouldn't have done. He was known around his community as a good person. He was upright and upstanding, and he did the right thing in every circumstance. And the first few verses also tell us that Job was a wealthy, wealthy man. He had 7 men and 3 daughters. That right there is an example of wealth in the ancient world. But on top of that, he had thousands and thousands and thousands of head of animals. He had oxen and sheep and goats and camels, and so much that he was the wealthiest man anybody knew. He was looked upon as a good person. He was wealthy, and people believed it was because God had blessed him for his uprightness and righteousness, and he cared about his family more than anything else. And then we hear about this divine council, this board meeting that takes place in heaven, and all the divine beings are there with God, and Satan comes walking in late to the meeting. Yeah, he was a divine being. He shows up late to the meeting. His sunglasses are probably a little crooked. Maybe he's got a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. And God goes, Satan, where you been? You're late for the meeting. Man, I've been down on earth, God. That's a cool place you created. I was walking to and fro and up and down. I saw the people. I saw the nature. I went to a few bars. That's such a cool place you've created down there. Oh, well, if you were down there going back and forth on earth, then you probably saw Job, my servant. Isn't he a wonderful person? He serves me. He loves me. He worships me. He does what's right. And Satan goes, well, of course he does. You've built a hedge around him and his property, and until somebody goes after it or attacks it, of course he's going to worship you. What else would you expect? And so Satan issues this wager with God. He says, but I'll bet you if you drop that hedge around him, I bet you if you let me go after his things, he's going to change his mind and he will curse you to his face. And God says, bet taken, go for it, but don't touch him. And that's when we get into the part we read where a servant comes running up and is like, Lord, Master, that they came and they took away the oxen and the donkey. And before he can even get done saying it, there's somebody else running up and going, Lord, Master, the Sabians came and they took all the other animals that we had and they killed all the servants and I'm the only one left. And before he could finish, the third guy comes running up and says, God, fire fell from heaven and all the sheep are destroyed and all the servants and I'm the only one left to tell you. And by this time, Job has got to be going, nothing else can happen, right? Have you ever had those times in your lives where it's just one thing after another, and after each thing you said, oh, it can't get any worse than this, and it does. For me, 2008 was that year. Something would go horribly wrong, and I'd go, well, nothing else can happen, and a week later, something worse happened, and it's like, well, nothing else. I finally quit saying nothing else can happen because it did. Have you ever had that experience where it just felt like life was beating you up moment after moment after moment? So things are bad enough. Job has now lost all of his wealth. And the worst news of all comes. Master, your sons and daughters were doing their usual partying, and this great wind came and lifted the roof, and they're all dead. It crushed them. His wife is left. But his children are gone. His legacy is gone. The future of his name is gone. And Job reacts very strangely. It says in 22 that he did not blame God or think that he committed any sin that caused God to punish him. That's tough enough, right? But now there's a second divine counsel. Satan shows up late again with his glasses cocked and a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. And he, where you been, Satan? Oh, man, I've been to and fro on that earth. It is so cool. So, you saw what happened with Job, right? He still didn't curse me. And he goes, skin for skin, God. Of course, nobody's going to curse you when they lose stuff, but you touch them, they'll curse you. Bet taken. And the next scene, Job is sitting in a pile of ash, covered from the soles of his feet to the top of his head with boils and sores. And this is kind of gross, but he has a piece of pottery, and he's using it to scrape those boils off of his skin. And we think he was probably sitting in ash for two reasons. One is a sign of mourning, but the other was because they think ash had some kind of a medicinal property on open sores. But he's there he's shaved his head. He's naked because he's torn his clothes. He's sitting in a pile of ash, head to toe. He's nothing but and he's scraping them off. How miserable. And his wife comes along, and we give her a bad rap. Go ahead and curse God and die. Why are you doing this? And our immediate reaction is, man, she was mean. But don't forget, if he lost everything, so did she. She was grieving. She was mourning the loss of her kids that she'd carried to term and had raised. And maybe what she said to Job was not really so much mean as it was compassionate, because she saw his misery and she shared his misery, and she thought maybe ending his life would bring him peace and painlessness. And of course he says, you're speaking like a foolish woman, and I'm sorry, that's what the text says. I didn't say that. But the impetus is, you've doubted God. You're blaming God for this? God wasn't to blame for this. And then pretty soon his friends hear what's going on with Job, and I think there was 7 of them altogether. And when they're approaching Job, they see him sit in this pile of ash covered in sores and scraping the sores off, and he's bleeding, and they're just like, oh my gosh. And the smartest thing they did in the whole story of Job is they sat quietly with Job for 7 days and showed compassion and solidarity for what he was going through. And that was great. But then they had to go and open their mouths and try to explain to Job why this was happening. And it was all stained glass windows and unicorns. I'm glad that Mindy picked this one song, and that last line is, but we will understand by and by. Maybe, maybe not. There's no promise that we're going to understand what we've been put through on earth. And these 3 people, at least 3 of them that we have the text for, oh, well, you must have sinned in your earlier life, and so God is punishing you for that. Job was like, no, I didn't. Person after person tries to blame Job or his family or God for what he's going through. We do that all the time, right? In 1993, when I had my big wreck and I broke my back in 2 or 3 places and several ribs and concussion or 2 and God knows what all else, I was in intensive care and induced coma for 3 days. I was in an 8.5-hour reconstructive surgery. I've got so much metal in my back right now, you probably couldn't lift me up. Fortunately, I can still get through the airports. I was in surgery for 8.5 hours. I was in the hospital for 16 days and then 6 months of rehabilitation. And at that particular time in my life, my theological place I was at theologically was much different. It was very Calvinistic, no free will. If God's sovereign, then that means everything that happens to me is somehow God's will. It's tough. So after my wreck, I'm sitting there thinking, okay, God, what did I do that was so bad that you had to almost kill me? I was told I was lucky I was alive, that I would probably never walk, and that if I did, I wouldn't walk normally. I would never carry a backpack again. I'd never be able to sleep on the ground in a tent, climb rocks, kayak, canoe, or climb mountains. My life's over then. Kill me now. So for the first few months, I was like, okay, God, what did I do in life that was so horrible that you had to almost kill me and destroy my family dynamic? Because one of the hardest things was when I got home, I was not allowed to pick up my son who was 6 weeks old. I did it anyway. And my daughter climbed up in my lap very carefully and started tapping on the brace that circled my entire body and said, "Daddy, I thought you were dead." What did I do, God? What was so bad? And I spent weeks recounting my life, trying to figure out what I might have done that was so bad that me and my family deserved this. And no, I wasn't perfect, but I had not committed any kind of a sin that deserved that kind of punishment. So I switched to the other part of Calvinism. Okay, Lord, what is it you're trying to teach me? Because the belief was, and we have some really bad theology around this, that God brings hard times into our lives to teach us lessons. Well, what he taught me was that God sometimes is a cruel parent, and maybe it was child abuse. Is that the kind of God I really want to worship and serve? For months, what is it I'm supposed to learn? What's the purpose of this? And finally, one day it dawned on me that God didn't have anything to do with any of this except to be there with me through it. The reason the bad thing happened because I was distracted by my new truck and forgot about the 2 hills right before a sudden stop sign at a majorly dangerous intersection, an eighth of a mile from my house. I failed to stop. I got T-boned and my truck rolled and almost killed me. That was my fault, not God's. There was nothing I needed to learn except to be a better driver. God wasn't punishing me because I'd done something horrible in my life. There was no lesson to learn. Sometimes life is just hard. And that is the whole point of this story of Job. We believe it was written by several authors, and it's a composite piece of literature. But that its one purpose was to explore this idea, is God retributive and transactional? In other words, if I do this, God does that, and if I don't do this, then God does that. If I sin, God punishes me. If I don't appease God, then I won't be wealthy or I won't do well in life. And the reason this is important is because as monotheism developed out of polytheism, all the gods that were worshipped before were believed to be transactional. It was tit for tat. If you gave enough sacrifice to these gods, then you had good crops and you had lots of kids and you had wealth and prosperity. If you failed to give to these gods or to please these gods, then bad things happened to you. And one of the troubles that the New Testament Christianity had, early church, was because they refused to worship those gods, and so their community around them were angry with them, because if you don't worship that God, then something bad's going to happen to all of us. And this got carried into monotheism, the worship of one God. And this became the question. If God is retributive and transactional and quid pro quo, like all the other gods, then why should we worship him? How is he any different? And what the authors are trying to explain here is that bad things happen just because bad things happen, and God does not cause them. God loves us. He cares about us. He wants the best for us, and he's not going to bring hard things into our lives. He's not going to punish us. He's not teaching us something. There's always things to learn. Because one of the things I learned from my wreck, if you fast forward 13 years, my daughter has just had a major surgery and they botched it, and she thinks she's in so much pain, she's going to die. And while we're sitting at Riley waiting for them to find a room for her, she looked at me and said, "Dad, you remember all that pain and suffering you went through with your back?" "Yeah." "Was it worth living through?" Because of what I went through, I was able to affirm to my daughter that yes, even in the midst of difficult times and intense pain, life is worth living. So now we have to ask ourselves this question: well, if God doesn't cause all these bad things to happen, then who does? Some things are just a product of the created world that we live in. Tectonic plates shift, and there are earthquakes. It's part of the natural process of creation, and people lose their property and lose their lives. As magma moves close to the thin areas of the crust, we have volcanoes, and when they erupt, people die. People lose everything. I used to say that tornadoes and hurricanes were the same way, but quite frankly, I'm not sure they are. If we look back over history and the generations and how we've treated this planet, we find out that there's a higher intensity of storms and a higher frequency of hurricanes and tornadoes and bad weather more recently because of climate change and global warming, and that's on us. We've created that evil that takes people's lives and put them in bad places. When we don't provide enough health care and enough safeguards where somebody like the young man in Indianapolis can get red flagged and then go buy 2 AR-15s and kill 10 people, that's on us. When we allow systemic evil and systemic racism to take place, and systemic poverty for that matter, to take place in our communities, in our culture, in our world, that's on us. So if you want somebody to blame for the bad things that happen, look at your neighbor, look at your community, look at yourself, look at me. Because it certainly isn't God. Is God punishing me? No. The world we live in is difficult because God loves us so much, He's given us free will, and we can use that free will to do good or to do evil. And when we individually do evil together with other people, it becomes systemic evil. It's what our baptismal vows have called us to fight against no matter where we find it. Oppression and evil, no matter where it exists. God is not to blame. Because God loves you, He loves me, and He wants the best for all of us, even in the midst of difficult times.